Please be seated. So it doesn't always happen that Passover overlaps with Maundy Thursday, but it does this year. It began last night. It is, of course, the central, most important holiday in Judaism, the celebration of Passover. Maybe arguably apart only from the Sabbath itself, which happens, of course, every 7 days and is often touted as being the most important holy day in Judaism. But during Passover, our Jewish friends gather and remember that they were slaves once in Egypt and that they were delivered from slavery. The point of that is to remember to always love people on the bottom rungs of society. Because we too, the Passover story says, we too have been on the bottom rungs. Now, if you actually read the story of Exodus, the story of the Passover, which we heard a little bit of tonight, there's actually a lot more to it than just we were slaves and now we're free. For one thing, again, as we heard a little bit of tonight, there is a lot of violence in the Passover story. As the Hebrew slaves escape, famously, the Red Sea is parted. They are able to pass through the sea. And once they are through, and while the Egyptians in their chariots are following them, the sea then closes, drowning all of the Egyptian army. There is a Mishnah, which is another part of Judaism's sacred text. There's a story in a Mishnah that at this moment, the angels begin singing praises when the Egyptians are drowned. And God actually rebukes them and says, "Why are you singing and rejoicing while the works of my hands are drowning in the sea?" So even within the Jewish sacred texts, there are multiple interpretations of how God would feel about that particular moment. And of course, there is a lot more violence than just that in the Old Testament. Perhaps some of you have struggled with that. How do we reconcile the version of God in the Old Testament with the version we see in Jesus? That is a very big question and not one I'm going to answer for you tonight. But one thing to remember, I think, is that like the Gospels, remember there are 4 Gospels and they each come from a different perspective. Some of the stories overlap, some of them don't. Some of the stories are there, but they're told differently in each Gospel. Just like that in the New Testament, the books of the Old Testament were written over hundreds, thousands of years by different people. Some of them looking back on history. A couple of them at the moment it was happening, roughly. They are all written by human beings, inspired by God. And every human has their own point of view. Every community has their own point of view. Part of what makes the Old Testament so rich and interesting, I think, is to see all those different viewpoints. You know, even within the book of Psalms, my friend, an Old Testament professor, was telling me this. There are 2 Psalms, one after the other. They're about the same historical event, but one of the Psalms is a psalm of celebration and one is a psalm of lament. So you get to see multiple perspectives, different theologies, if you will. But amongst all this violence in the Old Testament, there is a symbol that comes up repeatedly that we maybe don't think about too much. And that is the symbol of a cup. Sometimes this is referred to as the cup of wrath. And when these ancient nations are experiencing violence, it is often narrated as the cup has been passed to them. When violence is ending, the cup is passed away from them. And of course, famously, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus asks God to let this cup pass from him. It's a reference to that cup of wrath from the Old Testament. But at the Last Supper, the cup becomes something different. The bread becomes something different. It's not a sacrifice to appease an angry God or a punishment for disobeying the law. But the cup is a reality of God's presence with us, in the simple act of sharing a meal. That's all it is, what we do here for the Eucharist. People eating together and praying together. And this eating, sharing, Jesus is saying this is the cup of the new covenant. It's not a covenant that requires any kind of violence or punishment or wrath. It's not a covenant that requires shame. But it's a covenant where we promise ourselves to one another. And this simple meal, along with baptism, of course, is the central ritual for those of us who follow Jesus. I invite you to sit with that for a minute. Think about how ordinary it all is. How do we experience the presence of Jesus? Exactly how he told us to, which is by sharing a meal at a table where all are welcome. Even Judas, right? We heard tonight in the gospel reading, Jesus knows that there's one who's going to betray him, but he doesn't bar Judas from the table. Judas is invited too. Maybe you can think of some holy tables that you've sat at in your life, certainly in church, but there are, I think, these Eucharistic tables everywhere in the world. Places where we can find togetherness, welcome, that feeling of really being seen, of really being known. In the Christian worldview, these spaces of togetherness are the axis around which every other aspect of life turns. These are the spaces that have priority for those of us who follow Jesus. We don't always remember to make them a priority. Sometimes life gets very busy, and it seems like there are other things more important. But these simple Eucharistic tables all throughout our lives, this is the way we commune with the divine spirit that animates all of life. That divine spirit, that spirit who created star clusters and nebula and planets and people and starfish and sycamores and earthworms and blue whales, mosses, all of the minuscule forms of life that we can't even see. This holy presence is most transparently present with us, not in complicated grand gestures or self-mortification or psychedelics or long drawn-out prayers, all of these complicated things, but just in the simple act of eating together and welcoming one another and giving thanks for it. And the heart of this holy presence is made known in the work of caregiving, especially the caregiving that is done only by those on the lower rungs of society, which is who would be washing feet in the time of Jesus. Interesting side note, Jesus does a lot of things in the Last Supper that only women were supposed to do. Women, the service bearers. Jesus does them. Imagine that. This is how I want you to remember me, Jesus says. Remember that I love you. Remember that I am washing your feet. Remember that when you do this, I am with you. Thanks be to God.